Few years ago, I found myself sitting alone asking a question that I couldn't seem to answer. Why did relationships always feel so hard? Not hard because life happened, hard because every relationship has challenges. Hard in a way that felt exhausting. The kind of hard where you're constantly thinking about it, constantly analyzing it, constantly trying to figure out what went wrong, constantly wondering what I could have done differently. I spent years believing that was normal. I thought that was what commitment looked like. I thought loving someone meant working through things, being patient, giving grace, trying again. And to some extent, that's true. Every healthy relationship requires effort. But what I didn't understand at the time was the difference between effort and proving your worth. Because if I'm honest, for years I thought the problem was that I wasn't enough. Not smart enough, not attractive enough, not successful enough, not patient enough, not understanding enough, not easy enough to love. I don't think I would have said those words out loud back then, but when I look at my behavior, that's exactly what I believed. Because every time something felt off in a relationship, my first instinct wasn't to ask whether the relationship was healthy. My first instinct was to ask what I needed to do better. What did I miss? What should I change? How can I communicate better? How can I be more understanding? How can I make this work? And the crazy part is that I genuinely thought that was self awareness. I thought I was taking responsibility. I was doing the work. But looking back, I can see that I wasn't evaluating the relationship at all. I was evaluating myself over and over and over again. Every problem became evidence that I needed to improve. Every conflict became proof that I hadn't gotten it right yet. Every disappointment sent me searching for another way to become more worthy of the love I wanted. I was constantly trying to become enough. And the worst part was that every time I reached a new milestone, the feeling never lasted. I could accomplish something, learn something, achieve something, change something, and for a moment, I'd feel better. And then the question would come back. Am I enough now? Looking back, I wasn't just putting effort into relationships, I was trying to earn security. I was trying to earn consistency. I was trying to earn reassurance. I was trying to earn love. And somewhere along the line, I became so focused on proving my value that I stopped asking a much more important question. Was this relationship actually meeting my needs? I spent years focusing on everyone else's emotions, everyone else's comfort, everyone else's reactions. And I couldn't remember the last time I had genuinely asked myself, what do I need? What do I want? What feels right to me? What am I tolerating that I shouldn't be tolerating? I had become so focused on holding the relationship together that I stopped paying attention to myself inside of it. And that's when something started to shift. Because for the first time, I realized the relationship wasn't the only thing I needed to examine. I needed to examine the role I was playing inside of it. The realization didn't happen all at once. It wasn't one conversation. It wasn't one book. It wasn't one breakthrough moment where everything suddenly made sense. It happened slowly. Looking back at my marriage, looking back at relationships before it, looking back at the choices I made and the things I tolerated. And eventually I started noticing something. No matter what I accomplished, the question never went away. Am I enough now? When I became more successful, it was still there. When I worked harder on myself, it was still there. When I became more self aware, it was still there. When I learned to communicate better, it was still there. The goalpost kept moving. And for a long time, I thought that meant I still had more work to do. I thought there was another level to reach, another lesson to learn, another version of myself I needed to become. But eventually, the feeling would come back. And if I'm honest, it usually came back with even more intensity. It's kind of like the weight loss yo yo effect. You lose 5 pounds, you feel great, you think you're finally figured it out, then somehow you gain 20 back. Not only are you back where you started, but now you're carrying even more than before. That's what this felt like. I'd make progress, I'd accomplish something, I'd work on myself, I'd gain confidence, I'd feel stronger for a while, and then somehow I'd find myself right back in the same place asking the same question. Am I enough now? The temporary relief would wear off and the old doubts would come rushing back in, sometimes louder than before, sometimes stronger than ever. Because every time I tried to solve the feeling by achieving more, fixing more, learning more, or becoming more, I was accidentally reinforcing the belief underneath it, the belief that I wasn't enough yet. So instead of ending the cycle, I was feeding it. Every attempt to prove my worth became more evidence that my worth still needed to be proven. And that's why the finish line keeps moving, because there was never a finish line. There was only a belief. And no amount of achievement was ever going to heal a belief that told me I wasn't enough in the first place. And that was the moment everything started to change. Not because I suddenly felt worthy, not because all my insecurities disappeared, but because I finally stopped asking how to become enough. I started asking why I believed I wasn't enough in the first place. And that question led me somewhere I wasn't expecting. Because when I first started looking at the belief that I wasn't enough, I assumed I would find a single answer, a single moment, a single experience, something I could point to and say, there, that's where it started. But that's not what happened. What I found was much more uncomfortable. I couldn't find one single moment. I found hundreds of them. Small moments, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, moments I probably wouldn't have remembered if I wasn't looking for them. A criticism that stayed with me longer than it should have, a rejection I took personally, a disappointment I blamed myself for, a relationship where I worked harder instead of asking harder questions. Little moments that by themselves didn't seem important, but over time they started creating a story. And the thing about stories is that we don't realize we're living inside them. We think we're seeing reality. We think we're seeing ourselves clearly. We think we're making rational decisions, when in reality, we're often seeing life through the lens of a story we accepted years ago. For me, that story sounded something like this: if something isn't working, try harder. If someone pulls away, become better. If you're not getting what you need, improve yourself. If the relationship is struggling, figure out what you're doing wrong. And the reason that story was so dangerous is because it sounded responsible, it sounded mature, it sounded self aware. People praise those qualities. Take responsibility, do the work, look at your part, be accountable for your actions and decisions. And I absolutely believe in those things. I believe personal responsibility matters. I believe accountability matters. I believe growth requires us to look honestly at ourselves. In many ways, those beliefs helped me rebuild my life after divorce. But there is a difference between taking responsibility for your part and taking responsibility for everything. There's a difference between accountability and self blame. There's a difference between self awareness and self abandonment. I didn't understand that distinction back then. So every problem became a mirror. Every disappointment became evidence. Every conflict became another opportunity to figure out what I needed to fix about myself. I was always asking, what could I have done differently? What should I have said differently? How could I have handled this better? And those questions aren't bad questions. In fact, they're often healthy questions. The problem was that they became the only questions. I stopped asking whether the other person was taking responsibility. I stopped asking whether my needs were being met. I stopped asking whether the relationship itself was healthy. I became so focused on my side of the equation, I stopped evaluating the entire equation. And that's a dangerous place to live. Because when you're constantly looking inward, it's easy to miss what's happening around you. It's easy to keep adjusting yourself while ignoring the fact that something else may be needing change too. That's exactly what I was doing. I thought I was being accountable, but in many ways, I was carrying responsibility that was never mine to carry. That's what beliefs do. They become invisible. You stop recognizing them as beliefs. They start feeling like facts. I wasn't waking up every morning saying, I'm not enough, but I was living as if it were true. I was making decisions as if it were true. I was choosing relationships as if it were true. I was tolerating things as if it were true. I was overgiving. I was over explaining. I was overextending myself as if it were true. And because the belief was operating in the background, I couldn't see it. All I could see were the symptoms: the overthinking, the anxiety, the people pleasing, the constant need for reassurance, the fear of disappointing people, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of not being chosen. For years, I thought those were the problems. I didn't realize they were all connected to the same root. And once I started seeing that, I couldn't unsee it. I started noticing it everywhere. I saw it in the way I handled conflict. I saw it in the way I approached relationships. I saw it in the way I measured my value. I saw it in the way I reacted when someone was upset with me. I saw it when the way I felt responsible for other people's emotions. I saw it in the way I kept trying to earn things that should never have been needed to be earned in the first place: respect, consistency, honesty, love. And that's when another realization started to emerge. Maybe the reason I kept ending up in the same emotional experience wasn't because I kept finding the same people. Maybe it was because I kept bringing the same belief with me. And if that was true, then leaving a relationship wasn't enough. Starting over wasn't enough. Finding someone new wasn't enough. Because no matter where I went, I was still taking that belief with me. And once I saw that belief, something else started making sense. For years, I thought I was choosing the wrong people. I thought my problem was that I kept ending up in unhealthy relationships. I thought I needed to get better at spotting red flags. I thought I needed to make better choices. And while some of that was true, it wasn't the whole truth. Because when I really started paying attention, I noticed something. The pattern didn't start when the relationship became unhealthy. The pattern started long before that. It started in the way I entered relationships. It started in what I was attracted to. It started in what I overlooked. It started in what I excused. It started in what I normalized. Because when you don't fully believe you're enough, you don't approach relationships in the same way someone who does. You don't evaluate relationships from a place of worthiness. You evaluate them from a place of hope. Hope that this person will finally choose you. Hope that this relationship will finally work. Hope that this time you'll get the love you've been trying so hard to earn. And hope can be dangerous because hope has a way of keeping us invested long after reality has. Because hope has a way of keeping us invested long after reality is asking us to pay attention. I know I did it. There were things I ignored, things I explained away, things I minimized, things I knew didn't feel right. But instead of trusting myself, I kept giving it the benefit of the doubt. I kept waiting. I kept believing things would change. I kept believing that if I loved harder, communicated better, understood more, or gave it just a little more time, things would eventually become what I had hoped they could be. And that's where so many women get stuck. Not because they're weak, not because they're naive, not because they're broken, because they're trying to build a healthy relationship while operating from a belief that says they have to earn one. So instead of asking, does this relationship work for me? They're asking, what do I need to do to make this relationship work? That's a completely different question. One protects your self respect, the other slowly erodes it. And the scary part is, most of us don't realize we're doing it. We think we're being committed. We think we're being patient. We think we're being loving. And sometimes we are. But sometimes we're abandoning ourselves in the process. Sometimes we're staying connected to the hope of who someone could become while disconnecting from who they're showing us they are. I know I did it. I stayed attached to potential, to possibility, to what the relationship could be if certain things changed. The longer I stayed focused on potential, the easier it became to ignore the reality. Because potential feels good. Reality doesn't always feel good. Reality forces us to make decisions. Reality forces us to acknowledge what is. Reality forces us to accept things we may not want to accept. Potential allows us to postpone that moment. And if you're carrying a belief that says you're not enough, potential can become incredibly seductive because it keeps the dream alive, it keeps the hope alive, it keeps the possibility alive that if you just hold on a little longer, everything will finally come together. But eventually, I had to face the difficult truth. The relationship wasn't keeping me stuck, the belief was, because the belief was influencing what I would accept, what I tolerated, what I justified, what I waited for. And until I changed that belief, I could leave one relationship and walk right into another with the exact same experience. Different face, different story, same pattern. And here's the part that surprised me the most. I assumed that once I became aware of the pattern, everything would change. I thought awareness would be enough. I thought once I understood what I was doing, I would naturally make different choices. But that isn't what happened, because awareness and change are not the same thing. In fact, some of the hardest moments came after I became aware, because now I could see the pattern, but I was still carrying the conditioning. I was still carrying the beliefs. I was still carrying the emotional blueprint that had shaped so many of my relationships. And that's when I started noticing something else. Healthy love didn't feel the way I expected it to feel. I thought my healthy love would feel exciting. I thought healthy love would feel intense. I thought healthy love would create instant certainty. Instead, healthy love felt unfamiliar. Something in it felt boring. Sometimes I felt uncomfortable. Sometimes it even felt wrong. And that was confusing because for years I had told myself I wanted peace, I wanted consistency, I wanted honesty, and I wanted emotional safety. But when those things showed up, part of me didn't know what to do with them because chaos had become familiar, uncertainty had become familiar, the emotional highs and lows had become familiar, the waiting, the wondering, the overthinking, the chasing, and the hoping, and the yearning. All of it had become familiar. And human beings are naturally drawn toward what feels familiar, even when familiar hurts. That's one of the hardest truths to accept because we like to believe we make decisions based on what is healthy. But many times we make decisions based on what is known. That's why people can leave one relationship and find themselves in the exact same version of the same experience. Not because they consciously want pain, because their nervous system recognizes the pattern. It knows how to operate there. It knows how to survive there. That's where it feels warm and fuzzy. And it knows the rules there. Healthy relationships require something completely different. They require receiving trust. They require allowing yourself to be cared for. And they require letting go of the belief that love must be earned. And for someone who has spent years proving their worth, that can feel incredibly vulnerable. Because if you're no longer earning love, then what are you supposed to do? Just receive it? Just believe you're worthy? Just trust that you don't have to prove yourself? It sounds simple until you're the one trying to do it. Because receiving can feel far more uncomfortable than striving. Striving is familiar. Striving gives you something to do. Striving gives you something to fix, something to chase. Receiving requires you to sit with yourself. Receiving requires you to believe that your worth isn't tied to your performance. Receiving requires you to stop proving and start trusting. And that's where so many women get stuck. Not because they don't want healthy love, because healthy love requires a different version of them than the one that learned how to survive. The version that survived learned how to earn. The version that heals learns how to receive. And those are two very different skill sets. That's why breaking the pattern isn't just about choosing different people. It's about becoming someone who no longer needs to earn what should be freely given. For a long time, I thought healing meant becoming a different person. I thought I needed more confidence, more certainty, more self esteem, more healing, more growth, and more answers. I thought there would eventually be a point where I woke up one day and never questioned myself again, a point where I never doubted myself again, a point where I never felt insecure, a point where I always knew exactly what to do. But that's not what happened. The biggest shift in my life wasn't becoming a different person. It was learning to go trust myself. And that sounds so simple, almost too simple. But when you've spent years looking outside of yourself for validation, trust becomes incredibly difficult because trust requires you to believe in yourself. It requires you to listen when something feels off. Trust requires you to stop arguing with your intuition. It requires you to stop explaining away what you're seeing. Trust requires you to stop convincing yourself that what hurts doesn't actually hurt. And if I'm honest, that was one of the hardest things I had to learn because I had to become really good at talking myself out of what I knew. I knew when something didn't feel right. I knew when a boundary had been crossed. I knew when my needs weren't being met. I knew when I was settling. And I knew when I was overgiving. I knew when I was making excuses. The problem wasn't that I didn't know. The problem was that I had stopped trusting what I knew. Instead of listening to myself, I questioned myself. Instead of paying attention to what I was feeling, I explained it away. Instead of trusting my intuition, I kept looking for reasons not to. And eventually, I realized something. The pattern wasn't just repeating because I didn't know better. The pattern was repeating because every time my intuition spoke up, I overruled it. I talked myself out of it. I minimized it. I justified it. I waited for more evidence. I waited for certainty. I waited for permission. And while I was waiting, I abandoned myself. That's a hard truth to face because it's much easier to focus on what everyone else did. It's a lot easier to focus on how we were hurt. It's easier to focus on the relationship. But eventually, I had to be honest with myself. There were moments when I knew not everything, not the whole story, but enough. Enough to pause, enough to ask questions, to pay attention. And instead of trusting myself, I kept choosing hope over truth. I kept choosing potential over reality. I kept choosing what I wanted to be true over what was actually true. That's why rebuilding self-trust became such a big part of my healing. Not because I needed to become someone new, because I needed to come back to myself. I needed to learn that my thoughts mattered, my feelings mattered, and my needs mattered. My boundaries mattered, my intuition, and maybe most importantly, I needed to learn that I didn't have to earn a place in a relationship. I didn't have to earn respect. I didn't have to earn consistency. I didn't have to earn honesty. I didn't have to earn love. Healthy relationships aren't built on proving, they're built on mutual respect, mutual effort, accountability, care. The version of me that was always trying to become enough didn't know how to receive that. She only knew how to work for it. But the more I learned to trust myself, the less interested I became in proving myself. And that's when everything started to change. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly. One decision at a time, one boundary, one act of self trust. And before I knew it, I wasn't asking the question anymore: am I enough? Because I was finally building a relationship with the one person I had spent years abandoning: myself. And maybe that's the real lesson. For years, I thought the answer was becoming more confident, more successful, more healed, more self aware, more lovable. I thought if I could just become enough, everything else would finally fall into place. The relationship would work, the fear would go away, the overthinking would stop, the self doubt would disappear. But I looked back on it and I can see that I was chasing an answer to the wrong question, because the question was never, how do I become enough? The question was, Why do I believe I'm not? And those are two very different paths. One keeps you chasing, the other leads you home. When I stopped trying to prove my worth and started rebuilding trust with myself, something changed. Not because my life suddenly became perfect, not because I never struggled again, because I stopped measuring my value through someone else's ability to see it. I stopped needing another person to confirm what I needed to know about myself. And that's when the pattern began to lose its grip. Not all at once, it wasn't overnight, but little by little. Because every time I trusted myself, I strengthened something that had been missing for a long time. Every time I honored a boundary, every time I listened to my intuition, every time I chose reality over potential, every time I stopped abandoning myself to keep someone else comfortable, I was building something stronger than confidence. I was building self trust, and self trust changes everything. Because when you trust yourself, you stop chasing people who can't choose you. When you trust yourself, you stop negotiating your own needs. When you trust yourself, you stop confusing potential with reality. When you trust yourself, healthy love doesn't feel quite so foreign anymore. And maybe you've spent years asking the same question I asked myself. Am I enough? I want you to consider something. What if there was never anything wrong with your worth? What if the real work isn't becoming enough? What if the real work is learning to trust that you already are? If you're tired of understanding the pattern but still repeating it, I've created Mini Reclaim to help you identify beliefs, patterns, survival strategies that keep pulling you back to the same experience. The link is below. Start here. Because awareness is powerful, but awareness without action rarely creates change. And that's exactly why I created it.